A slap is the universal sign of disrespect. But there was one slap which was so hard that it went into the history books. That slap occurred in Algiers, setting off a chain reaction, finding the French philosopher Franz Fanon, helping the Algerian independence movement undo the slap's consequences 100 years later. That experience in Algiers led to Franz Fanon writing the Wretched of the Earth, the definitive account of colonialism and decolonialism, as well as being possibly the most powerful work arguing for the legitimacy of political violence. And by going through Franz Fanon's Algeria, we can explain the full breadth of the slap's consequences. Algeria as a unified country was really a product of French colonialism post-slap. Pre-slap, there was the Regency of Algiers, acting as a semi-independent Ottoman province with fluid boundaries that was sandwiched in between the Tunis Beylik to the east and the Moroccan Sultanate to the west. The Regency only really controlled the coastline with a partial interior. To the far south, you could find the sparsely populated Sahara, but to the north, Algiers had made its name in the Mediterranean as a pirating power, using their maritime skills for self-defense, while also raiding the European coastline, partaking in a bit of Christian slave trading as well. Internally, the region was pretty diverse, made up of the Berbers, the Arabs, Turks, Jews, and some Christians, all governed together in beyliks that controlled local administration, with a lot of autonomy provided by the Ottoman Empire. There was even a relatively unstable, limited democracy in deciding the day of Algiers, which Rousseau would note as a relatively impressive achievement. But the story of Algiers' colonization begins with the Fly Whisk affair, which saw the French owing a substantial sum of money to merchants who had sourced that money from the Day of Algiers, and that debt wouldn't be paid for decades. The French sent a diplomat to speak with the Dey about this debt, but ended up insulting the Dey in some way, and consequently got a big slap across the face, with the equivalent of a fly swatter. Now, the French at the time were ruled by Charles X, who was looking a little bit dictator-y in France, and needed a foreign policy win to get the public back on side. Now, Algiers had just insulted French honor, and had long been a target for the recently passed Napoleon Bonaparte, along with the excuse of piracy and the slave trade would act as good propaganda to invade Algiers. With the French actually using Napoleon's plans that he had drafted to invade Algiers decades before. And it is worth noting that while piracy and the slave trade was used as excuses for this, both had been much more limited in recent times in Algiers, so it was a fairly flimsy excuse for an invasion. That invasion, starting as a limited assault on the ports along the coastline in 1830, would shift to the complete and utter control of all the Algiers Regency, resulting in a 30-year slaughter of between 500,000 to 1 million locals, with the French even having a decent number of losses themselves. This strategy of total regional control became the blueprint of France's new colonial conquests. That going forward with the Algiers region, now known as Algeria, a proud centerpiece considered a part of France itself and not just an external property. But France didn't just plant a flag. Colonialism was a process where an external state comes in and violently destroys the pre-existing social structure and replaces it with a new structure that would fit into the colonial power's interests. In Algeria, this interest was hundreds of thousands of hectares of arable, profitable land, which the French generals, bureaucrats, and bourgeoisie would either buy for cents on the dollar or take by less peaceful means, even seizing communal or religious land. But it wasn't just the rich taking part of this. Before the fight had even stopped, French, Italian, and Spanish emigres had already started moving into the cities to find their fortune in the new North African frontier, settling in former Arab or Berber properties and receiving government assistance while setting up European communities. By the end of the colonial process, these settler communities would number a population of 1 million. Meanwhile, the dispossessed and wounded locals would find themselves within a legal gray area for decades in colonialism, not French, but also not recognized as any other actual nationality, subjects without rights, in a land whose social fabric had just been burned and replaced. It was only until the native code came into place that the Muslim community would see their position clarified. There were now two kinds of people in Algeria: those who adopted French Christian rule and would be afforded French citizenship, and those who abided by the now void Muslim legal system, not allowed French citizenship, and remaining in legal purgatory as the colonial system solidified. The two-tier legal system that was found here split everyone in the region into either colonizers or the colonized. This relationship was one of total dominance and mutual exclusivity. You were either the colonized or the colonizer, and the colonizer was always superior to the colonized. The creation of two strictly divided and compartmentalized races. Those two compartments had a border patrolled by the police and soldiers facing towards the colonized, keeping a close and active presence. There was no ideology which masked the police's aggression. The colonial society was established in violent conquest and maintained control through violence. Colonialism's new system became a vehicle for the colonizer on top, who promoted the colonizing power's interests, creating them as the exceptional, legally protected, economically benefited subject, validated by the system, while the colonized consequently became the subject who was non-essential, legally neglected, and economically disadvantaged. The colonized subject who resisted was not just a criminal, but someone who was actively attempting to harm the interests of the colonial power, the only goal of this new society. Any attack on these interests would see the colonizers and the police respond with unextended, overcompensated violence which reminded the colonized of their new place in society. Algerians witnessed this violence in their loss of independence, but would frequently see the European settlers, the Pied Noir, and colonial police respond with graphic brutality, even after Algeria was completely colonized. Now, the work of colonization wasn't simply changing the economic structure of society, but would seep into the culture as well. French strategy moved to a position of assimilation following the native code. Now, with education in the region, Algiers and the surrounding area had a very well-established network of schools before 1830, with most of the locals being able to read Arabic. This would change with the assimilation effort, as French cultural values would be enforced, with traditional cultural values being repressed. This was especially seen in the new school network that would be highly concentrated in the settler communities, leaving the majority of the colonized with very limited means towards an official education. It would also see European values become the official truth, while the traditional regional values became inferior lies. Adding to this, the colonized community were not just deprived of their land, culture, and identity, but were often even deprived of food. There were frequent famines seen under French occupation of Algiers, which was only made worse by the great levels of poverty seen in native areas. Meanwhile, the growing settler community owned farming land which was producing perfectly fine food destined for European markets. With this level of deprivation, the colonial administration and settlers knew that they were outnumbered by their potential enemies in Algeria. But additional to assimilation, the divide and conquer strategy was used, with the promotion of the Kabyle myth, which claimed that the Berber communities in the region were actually lost Christians who had been forced into Islam. Which wasn't the only lazy attempt at sowing division. The French would also eventually provide the local Jewish population with easy access to French citizenship, and specifically promote the French cultural values to them, creating another specialized colonized group. Then there was the physical division, which France implemented, splitting Algeria into 3 departments. Algeria would get representation in the French Senate, and had a decent degree of local autonomy following the easing of military rule, but predictably Muslims were not allowed a majority in any council, provided with limited Senate representation, and were not allowed to be mayors or assistant mayors. The settler Pied Noir had total political control and substantial lobbying power within France itself. So we can create a list and say that the colonized Algerians were poor, starved, disenfranchised, geographically restricted, and undereducated, while the European settlers were compensated, served, politically dominant, geographically privileged, and well educated. This was the resting state of the colonizer-colonized relationship in the colonial system. These physical and cultural divides also became psychological as time passed. The supposed superiority of the colonized, socially, politically, and economically, convinced the settlers themselves that they were somehow better than the colonized, as the system they lived within validated their value as a privileged people continually. Conversely, the colonized were devalued in every aspect by the system and left them feeling as not just like temporarily disadvantaged subjects, but as the very lack of value itself, as the very lack of humanity. The privileged settler community started to view the colonized as an unhuman who corrupted any rights or privileges you might provide to them. In the settler view, the colonized just couldn't be trusted in any sense. The colonized became viewed as the physical incarnation of evil. Logically, then, assimilation in Algeria was hinged on this idea that you weren't just doing a surface-level cultural change, but you were destroying the pre-existing Muslim culture, which had outlived the physical destruction of the Islamic, legal, and political systems. In the minds of the recently colonized, there still lived a non-colonial space, which the colonizers viewed as having to be replaced, because it might work against the agenda of the colonizing power. As long as the locals had some remnant of that pre-colonial time living in their mind, they were still in some way resisting the French and not accepting in some way how the system defined them as dependent upon the colonizer. On the other hand, it was the physical restrictions and the psychological inferiority complex of the colonized which validated the position of the settlers. The colonized suffering was a necessary condition for the continued privilege of the colonized. That relationship would produce a certain view between each community, a colonial gaze. The colonizer occupies a position of not just privilege but of externality to the colonial land, and deserved all their privileges and dominance, while the colonized logically viewed the position of the colonizer with great envy. Everything the foreign colonizer owned appeared desirable and yours by right. Why should the settler have the good farming land, good houses, good food, while the locals suffered? And this envious gaze didn't go by unnoticed. The colonizer recognized it and wasn't able to understand the reasoning, but was able to understand its threat to their position. The settler believed they had to proactively protect what was theirs by pushing down the colonized. Even hope was a possession the colonized couldn't be trusted with. Any attempt at political, economic, or social reform by either the colonized or metropolitan France was always met with violent protest by the Pied Noir settlers in Algeria. Any form of resistance by the actual Algerians was met with overreactive discipline, almost always in the form of active violence. This exhibitionist violence of the colonizers by both the police and the Pied Noir wasn't just a suppression of the colonized to set an example, but a psychological reassurance to the colonizer that their power was real and their position was safe. It was this continual need to exhibit their position of power over the colonized that led to a great tension and frustration in the colonized body and mind. Like a spring being contorted in a Newtonian battle between a great aggressive force and a tightly wound, bulking object, creating this ever-increasing cycle put in place by the colonizer that would see the downfall of their own system and the whole colonial society. Colonialism as a system and colonization as a process only leaves one route for escape to the natives: decolonization. Decolonization being the violent replacement of the colonizer with the colonized, totally overturning the colonial social fabric through an enraged decolonial consciousness. That enraged consciousness bloomed from the frustration of the colonized becoming so pronounced as it goes through these failed attempts at release, coming to its final option, a violent and sustained strike at the colonizers. Before the release takes a decolonial shape, striking vertically, it would lash out unsuccessfully horizontally. Blood feuds are enacted, tribal or ethnic divisions become more pronounced. Some colonized individuals even reported literal body spasms due to the unbearable tension they found in their mental circumstances. Unsurprisingly, the act of dancing would also become this form of release, a permissive space where collective ecstasy could provide some form of comfort. Those releases are ultimately unsuccessful as they don't change the colonial circumstances producing the frustration. So the tension just builds and fills the air so palpably that the colonizers and police can even start feeling that tension in the air, most likely leading to even more exhibitionist violence. This kind of breaking point would be seen in Algeria in 1870 in the Mokrani Revolt. The revolt itself was generally made up of peasants as a class term, not a judgmental term. The revolt was unorganized, only really partially supported. It would feel, but it was a valuable lesson. The enraged decolonial consciousness needed to be properly conducted for success. After the revolt, actual resistance was limited to its daily characteristics. Even the simplest act of practicing local tradition in the privacy of your own home became this silent format of protest against French assimilation. It would only be after the two world wars when nationalist movements would start taking shape again in Algeria, with Algerians fighting and losing their lives in both of those world wars. By the 1940s, there were three branches of Algerian political movements: the democratic socialists, the liberal reformers, and the religious nationalists. Fanon points out how these groups would attempt to negotiate within the political system and use political language towards meaningful reform, but all three were destined to fail. Their political parties would get banned, their leaders would get arrested, and their gatherings would be heavily policed. Even political language directed to the French Senate was blocked by settler lobby groups who would violently protest any form of help for the Algerians. But this was all necessary from a decolonial perspective. It had to be shown to everyone that political language would fail, but would build this symbolic idea of an Algerian nationhood and laid the groundwork for an organized resistance. Following the failure of political language as resistance, Algerians used protest in 1945, waving the new Algerian independence flag while celebrating the end of World War II. Even this act of minor resistance, just waving a flag, would anger the local authorities and see shots fired into the crowd in Sétif and Guelma. The crowd responded in kind with a riot, killing 102 Pied Noir and police, which was brutal, but what followed the riot was a massacre. Between 1,500 to 45,000 Algerians would be killed as a response to the protest, with the French never counting the number of Algerians they would kill throughout their colonial stay, so we could only ever estimate, as the French just didn't value the lives of the Algerians to any degree. But again, even the slightest form of peaceful, non-violent language, a protest with a flag, was met with shots in a crowd, and a riot was met with unimaginable organized violence by a set of colonizers who were at the exact same time critiquing the horrors of World War II. It is at this point, with all alternative forms of communication being unsuccessful, that it became so obvious to the Algerians that the only real language of the colonial system is violence. The only real solution is complete decolonization, no matter the cost. And oftentimes in these colonial settings, it's an event like the massacre in Sétif, which not only brings about the violent realization of colonial language, but also sees the colonized realize something about themselves. In such a moment, there's a consciousness of their unified position, the crystallization of a national identity born of a shared victimhood to colonial violence. The divided Algerian political movement came together in 1954 and declared a war against colonial France, not requesting reform, but a complete expulsion of their oppressors. An 8-year-long war which saw a great deal of violence not only damaged France's reputation internationally, but even led to an internal government collapse within Paris. And just to briefly go through the war, as it began, France had just lost another decolonial war in Indochina. The FLN, Algeria's new united political movement, mirrored the tactic of the Indochinese, fighting a guerrilla war with limited troops who were split into regional cells, supported by an external military from outside Algerian borders, presenting that the decolonial process was not just a singular national movement, but a shared international movement of all colonized people learning from one another. Initially, the FLN only targeted military and economic objectives, attempting to goad the French into excessive violent responses, which would convince the wider Algerian public to join the resistance by showing how the colonizers would enact violence on you, whether you helped or not. It took a while for France to really consider the FLN as a serious threat, but following the Battle of Algiers, they happily obliged to commit atrocious violence. French troops used mass torture frequently and excessively. The Pieds Noirs went on rat hunts for FLN collaborating Muslims. They would deport people to separate other French colonies. The French police would actually kill some Algerians within France itself, and a mass relocation of rural Algerians took place to limit further FLN collaboration, but in doing so, displaced thousands upon thousands of people in the process. It was only a matter of time before most Algerians were on the side of the FLN, especially after the massacres in Philippeville. As the war moved on, the FLN did start using violence against civilians and even at times used violence against their own population to maintain a united front. French journalists would look on and claim that the objective and official European values were not being upheld by the Algerian militants, who were just as bad as the French army, weaponizing objectivity to invalidate the decolonial armed struggle. But Fanon argued the truth didn't lie in the moments of the conflict, but in the existence of the colonized peasants, who knew the reality of their conditions. The messy violence of the decolonization was merely a translation of the language colonialism made normal, made systematic. As the conflict began to favor the Algerians, locally and internationally, the French would offer serious reforms to political leaders, but it was really too late. Political language had been left behind, and the excessive violence of the French no longer inspired fear in the Algerians, but saw a continued organized response. The colonized had adapted to the language of violence. The unbalanced, entangled relationship of the colonizer-colonized had become a death spiral. But in the process, the colonized had destroyed their inferiority complex as they watched their supposed superior colonizers bleed. Fanon went as far as to say that in this circumstance, the violence of the colonized was cleansing to their psychology, but would only really find its true catharsis in victory. By the time independence had been announced and established in 1962, ironically, the national consciousness of the Algerians had long been established before the official naming of an independent state. But the next task would be no less difficult than the fight to achieve it: nation building. The decolonization process is one of complete transformation. The colonial process destroys the pre-existing society and created the colonial subject. So the decolonial process again destroys the colonial society, uplifting the colonized subject as the privileged subject. For this, the removal of all French colonial influence didn't mean destroying the roads or the farmland the French had cultivated, but removing the economic and political and cultural structures which had maintained the colonizer-colonized relationship. Things like the native code, the education system, the land divides all had to go. Unfortunately, this left the messy situation with the Pieds Noirs, most of whom would never accept Algerian citizenship. So, the new Algerian government, led by the FLN, provided the Pieds Noirs with a few years of additional French citizenship, which would transfer to Algerian citizenship after the transition period. This was a bit awkward, as the Pieds Noirs had burned most of their bridges during the Independence War, which not only involved the rat hunts, but also them establishing a paramilitary organization in the latter stages, recklessly lashing out as the colonial system died, even attacking the French authorities by the end of the conflict. The vast majority of the Pieds Noirs left Algeria for France, along with a substantial number of the Jewish community and some Muslims who had collaborated with the French. And the messiness of liberation didn't end there. While Fanon does state that violence is legitimate in the struggle against colonialism, he was aware that it left a lasting impression. In the Wretched of the Earth, Fanon would dedicate a whole chapter to case studies of mental disorders which were produced by colonialism, but also due to the violence of liberation, which had affected both the colonized and the colonizer. We can maybe say that colonization had been characterized by this growing tension. Decolonization had been a release of that tension, but liberation was a silence, leaving the survivors having to scrape through the mental rubble after the adrenaline wore off. The lasting effects of violence needed its own transition from the colonized subject to the liberated subject, a transition which would require a new generation with its own liberated consciousness. That new generation, who comes about well after the actual liberation struggle, would have no experience of colonialism and could be the ones to push forward into something not just decolonial, but independent of the language of violence itself. The final challenge the newly founded Algerian nation faced was the international challenge. The liberation movement found themselves wedged between the Cold War adversaries, while also having to build the country with a tired, war-torn population. Algeria tactfully flirted with both the US and the Soviets for aid, while making an agreement with the French for access to their Saharan oil reserves in exchange for assistance. With these complex surroundings, the FLN retained sole power of Algerian politics, first led by Ben Bella, then Houari Boumediene. Both led with differing styles of socialist leadership, but more importantly for Fanon, both presented as singular conduits for Algerian national interests in the face of US, Soviet, and French meddling. Fanon would compare this to a Castro-esque style of leadership which prioritized national interest and protection from colonial influences which a democratic politics might be susceptible to. Something which I'm not sure that I agree with, but I get the argument that he's making. The FLN would certainly make mistakes and shouldn't be wholly praised for their mixed outcomes, but even their mistakes were still exercises in self-determination. Many of the colonial powers would look down their nose at the newly independent countries, claiming they would have been better off under the control of the wealthy First World. But liberation saw a legal status provided to the decolonial subject, which was never available in colonialism, and created a sovereign power that relied on the immediate population providing a privilege to the Algerians never afforded by the French. A colonial power who had continually privileged the settlers, continually threatened the Algerians with violence, famine, and complete death, as long as it benefited their agenda. And if that story sounds similar to anything in the modern day, where a settler community exerts a disproportionate amount of power and privilege over locals while supported by a greater foreign power, then maybe Fanon's writing still rings true. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment, letting me know if there's any philosophical text that you'd like to hear explained, But in the meantime, if you'd like to watch something else, I have a video on the French state explained by Foucault, or even my last main video on Albania's field transition in the 90s, explained through reification